All right, the other big event taking place tomorrow, of course, is the meeting that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken will have with his Indian counterpart. He's set to meet Ajit Doval, the National Security Advisor, as well as Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The reason why everyone is so interested and excited about Blinken's visit is because he's the third senior official to have visited India from the Biden administration since they took over in January this year. It's his first visit as Secretary of State. It's coming ahead of the in-person Quad meet as well as the 2+2 set for later this year, and in the midst of a US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, which has to be completed by August, and because of which the Taliban is getting very active again. In fact, they've recaptured large swaths of the country, and everyone in the region is understandably worried about what that means. Any conversation with the United States nowadays at least has China in its focus and its growing dominance in the region. India is seen as a counter to that. Those and many other issues will possibly make it to the discussion table. But what should we look out for? Why is it important? To speak on this, I'm joined today by Rick Rossow. I'm speaking with Mukesh Aghi today. Former Ambassador Leela K. Ponappa is joining us on the show, as is former Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. Welcome to all of you, and great to have you on the show. Let me go to you, Ambassador Prakash, first, just to set the tone on why you think the Blinken visit is important, especially in the context of what's happening in Afghanistan right now.
Tamanna, greetings. As you mentioned, the current administration is barely 6 months old, and we have had 3 ministerial visits. The momentum in terms of exchanges, high-level contacts is quite encouraging. Our External Affairs Minister was in Washington in May. I have not seen the Secretary of State or the External Affairs Ministers of India meeting so often and so regularly. And the canvas, we are global and strategic partners, and the canvas of the relationship is very broad in terms of bilateral, regional, and international. And as you mentioned, some of the issues that are likely to figure prominently will include Afghanistan, will include Myanmar, because the US and India have some views on Myanmar. I'm sure they will discuss Pakistan, the country that cannot be named, or the dragon in the room. And then there are a host of trade issues, the Quad Summit, the defense relationship, and so on and so forth. It's a very broad canvas, and I am quite confident that they will go into the nitty-gritty of many issues, which will have an impact on the momentum as we move forward into this relationship, and plan also for a bilateral summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden.
You know, Ambassador Ponappa, before this meeting, there was a briefing at the White House where the Assistant Secretary of State was asked a question about human rights and democracy, etc., in the context of the Indian government, where the quote that came out of it was, yes, we will take up this issue. Then there was a counter by government sources saying we're ready to talk about anything. The question is, will this democratic government, which has a certain voter base to appease as well back home, take up issues like CAA, NRC, all of the tightening of screws on Twitter, etc. in this visit? Do you think it will be part of the conversation at all?
I'm assuming that when Secretary Blinken holds his talks with his counterpart, Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, with the NSA and with the Prime Minister, it will be a dialogue and not just a one-way kind of input into just America's views. I think there are human rights issues that India too might be interested in hearing about with regard to the United States. So I think we really need to view it as a dialogue and not as a kind of issue that a country like the United States, which is in a partnership relationship with India and vice versa, would be taking up. But I think I'd also like to comment on Vishnu's point with regard to the whole range of issues. Is this a visit of business as usual? You could say that because Secretary Blinken has been in office for about 6 months, he's visited a host of other countries, including Iceland, Greece, Japan, and so on. And so now it was time to visit India. But I really think the timing is significant for the precise reason that both you and Vishnu have commented on, namely the American withdrawal in Afghanistan and what it signifies for security, certainly in the region, and I would say globally as well. But domestic issues, as I said, they exist in both countries. We've seen how America has dealt with some of its challenges in recent months. And there may or may not be a dialogue on it, but I think it will be one of really many other important issues that both sides discuss.
Yeah. Rick, how do you look at this visit? Do you think that the more contentious issues of maybe the perceived problems that American companies in India are facing will not perhaps be on the table this time? A trade deal will not be broached this time? Or do you think it'll be very much part of the agenda?
At best, I think a lot of those commercial issues will be brought up on the periphery. The United States and India both manage our relationship in specific silos, and State Department doesn't try to cross over too deeply into the other silos. So we have a trade policy forum that's led by the U.S. Trade Representative and Indian Ministry of Commerce. We have a commercial dialogue, a CEO forum, and of course, all the great work that the trade associations, including Mukesh's, do to make sure the business interests are heard. So it may get brought up on the periphery. I don't think it's going to be a major focus area. There are some commercial undertones, though, for work that we're talking about doing on behalf of the Quad, for instance. And so, it could be brought up in that context, not so much on a bilateral nature or trying to resolve specific trade disputes, but, talking about more progressive ways that we can cooperate, collectively. The Quad has got working groups now. One of them looks at strategic technologies, which is one of the sectors that, broadly defined, that China's looking to try to dominate global manufacturing flows, which has been a primary underpinning for both of our relative protectionist sentiments that we have in Delhi and DC in recent years. So it'll get brought up bilaterally on the periphery, a little bit more directly as some of the opportunity that we might face in the Quad going forward. But I do think that it still remains a big gap in the relationship. I think our existing dialogues and commercial issues aren't making progress. They aren't looking at the positive progressive agenda as much as they should be. So it'll not be on the agenda in a big way, and it remains a pretty big gap in terms of looking at positive opportunities.
Yeah, why this visit is also important is because the Trump administration and the Modi government, despite its ups and downs, seem to have some sort of an understanding and moving ahead. This question was asked before the visit, and the response was clearly that this is a bipartisan, long-standing relationship growing between India and the United States. It will continue so. But Mukesh Aghi, what will you be looking out for in terms of concrete announcements that come out of this trip?
Well, you have to understand the Trump approach and Biden approach is very different with India. Objectives are the same. There is a convergence, there are alignment, especially on geopolitical side. But the Biden approach is multilateral. It's much more structured. And its focus at the moment, the current visit focused more on geopolitical alignment between the two countries. Within that framework, you will see certain economic agenda being driven, such as cybersecurity, on the vaccine diplomacy, focusing on strategic technologies together, secure supply chain. So what I see is that while geopolitical discussion will take place on Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, etc., but it is important for India, from India's perspective, to go beyond that and drive the economic agenda under the Quad partnership itself. Because if India plans to grow its economy by 8-9% on an annual basis, if it wants to be a $5 trillion economy, it will need approximately $100 billion FDI on an annual basis, specifically coming from the United States. And what we're seeing is the momentum is there. Today, the FDI is up by 19%, even though during the COVID crisis. But we expect this number to cross $100 billion for the economy to move forward. So I think while the discussion will be on the Quad side, underlying discussion will be also on the economic partnership, specifically between the two countries.
You know, just to speak a little bit more on the Quad side, Ambassador Ponappa, you spoke about the backdrop of what's happening in Afghanistan. The other big question, of course, is China and how the Biden administration is looking at China. Now, the Biden administration is making its moves to have a more stable, I would say, working relationship with China as compared to the Trump administration. Where does India now fit into this picture vis-a-vis the Quad?
I think the Quad is an exploratory exercise to try to figure out a fresh model, if you will, for a post-COVID regional, if not, definitely not a world order, but certainly for an Indo-Pacific order, rules-based, open, inclusive, and so on. And very clearly, China is a major factor, not just an elephant, an unnamed elephant in the room, but certainly very much on everyone's consciousness. I think the Biden administration is still working its way through in terms of how to engage China. You will not get the high dramatic statements or positive or negative views that came out of the former administration. But there are professionals, or very seasoned professionals within the US government who can possibly take this forward. I would say that there is not yet clarity on how they would move, partly because China tends to keep not just the United States, but everyone else guessing in terms of how it is going to function. I mean, we've heard of the kinds of statements that were made during the centenary celebration of the Chinese Communist Party, the kind of statements that Xi Jinping made. And also, I think China's stated objectives with regard to all its surrounding region, both maritime and land-based. So I think this is a picture that is yet to evolve, and yet there is no question that, as has been discussed really for a couple of decades, ever since China started prospering, how do you ensure that the rise of China is peaceful and that it functions as a responsible member of the international community? But I think the Indo-Pacific debate, the Quad debate, is still to evolve in terms of how it's going to work. For India, we have implications both by land and by sea, I think in terms of our trade interests, both with East Asia and with the United States. The South China Sea is a vital area of passage. And then, of course, we are the only country in the Quad that has a direct border with China in terms of land border. Japan, of course, is a neighbor by sea. They have disputes over islands. But I think in terms of the engagement that we saw last year at Galwan, there is no question that India faces challenges that none of the other Quad members do. So these are still, there's no firm shape or structure yet to the Quad or to the security discourse, but there's no question also that all the countries are trying to establish some kind of an equation of how to deal with the situation.
Yeah. So let's come down to brass tacks then. Ambassador Prakash, what are the solid key takeaways that will come out of this meeting at all? Or is it just going to be a preliminary setting the stage for the next round of 2+2?
Well, it's a bit of both. There are outcomes and it's a process. Given the relationship and the relationship which has been built brick by brick over the last 20 years, it is not an end in itself. It's a process. They will be discussing, as we have already covered, a host of issues. And in some cases, perhaps there will be an outcome where they'll come to some kind of an understanding. In some cases, they will agree to discuss further. Or in other cases, they may agree to disagree, because that is how diplomacy is conducted, and that's how I see it happen. If I may, I would like to, can I touch upon the issue of human rights and other bits that you mentioned, or we move on?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think that we should not be, and we are not at all bashful in discussing anything that we need to discuss with a friendly country, a fellow democracy like the US. India, I'm convinced we have nothing, everything that we do is in the open. We are not perfect. No country is perfect. We have aberrations. Other countries have aberrations. So why should we hesitate in discussing anything that needs to be discussed? Well, as my co-panelists have mentioned, we also have 4 million people of Indian origin in the US. We also have concerns about the hate crimes, about the police brutalities, etc. But it's not that we are pointing fingers at each other. We are discussing things that need to be discussed. So I think that when it comes to a country like the US, and given the broad canvas that we have, we are bound to have divergences. And it will be unnatural not to have divergences. But the point is that the convergences far outweigh the divergences. And we today have the maturity of discussing anything. And that is the strength of the relationship.
Let me get Rick's perspective on this. The divergences will be outweighed by the common goals right now. That is, of course, a given. But I want to speak specifically about what Biden's constituency is in the United States right now and how those noises need to be made. That was a concern that was raised even when the Biden administration came into power in America vis-a-vis India and some of India's rules and laws. What is your take on it? Do you think that this is a slightly sensitive topic which maybe Blinken will not want to touch upon?
I think he'll have to bring it up. I think, successive U.S. leaders, barring, I think, the period when Trump was in office, when they had a stated, policy that they weren't going to intervene in other countries' domestic affairs, the same way that other administrations had. But, even President Obama's historic visit to India for Republic Day, his final speech and one of his first speeches when he got back to the United States talked about issues of religious tolerance. So it's been on the table for high-level meetings, but it hasn't disrupted the agenda. And I think, to that extent, we've seen from the early days, I think even surprising to a lot of us, that despite, obviously Prime Minister Modi having his visa revoked and things like that, when the United States, reached out to engage, they find that Prime Minister Modi was very willing to engage back. So I think looking past issues when there's so much substance on the table, as Mukesh said, the United States is going to be a vital partner for India for foreign direct investment to create jobs, a vital partner for India for investment to restore the economy and provide more of an economic bulwark against China, a critical partner for sharing of strategic technologies, a defense partner. India is not going to be able to manage all the ways that China is going to be able to get in and begin operating more actively in India's neighborhood solo, and the United States has a lot to offer there. So I think as long as we're making progress on these quantitative subjects that India considers critical for national security and autonomy in the future, then I think bringing up these issues of human rights and religious tolerance, they'll be on the table, but they're not going to disrupt the broader agenda. There'll be a lot of hue and cry about that, and I think the administration has got to bring it up. But then you've got other areas where you've got pretty good complementarity. The administration also considers climate change a tier 1 focus. And, it's an area that we've seen the Prime Minister articulate some pretty robust targets. And so I think some of the areas that I think Biden's political constituents are driving him towards, you're actually going to find a lot of opportunities to work together. So that agenda is not entirely going to pull apart. But there definitely be some areas of tension, but the positives outweigh, I think, right now.
Right. Mr. Aghi, the other point that we've not really discussed today, but I think is important to touch upon and to understand whether it's going to be an issue or not. Look at the action and the rules that India has made, Indian law has made, which are impacting American companies working here one way or the other, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Google on your tech giant side, whether it's a player like Amazon or even MasterCard recently because of rules of data protection that we have. Is this on the radar at all for the Biden administration?
It is. You have to understand two principles which are driving this relationship. One is a military strong India is good for regional stability, and a prosperous India is good for American companies. And when you look at from those principles, it is important that companies such as Google or Facebook or Uber, they are dominating the Indian environment while they're banned in China. Now, what really happens is while we're trying to encourage these companies to invest more, grow more in India, it is important to create a level playing field. To go ahead and ban MasterCard, which is the blue chip companies of America operating on 200 countries itself, because they were delayed in providing a regulatory information, is a little heavy-handed. And I think when you have friends, when you have partners, you try to sort out issues rather than trying to ban them. That sends a strong negative message to the rest of the investing community, and it makes our job much more difficult trying to encourage companies to come into the US, into India, and invest more itself. So I think we need to have a little more maturity dealing with these issues. We need to have more patience and have more dialogue trying to sort out the issues, because it's a win-win perspective and for both countries to work together, especially on the economic zone and on the geopolitical zone also.
Right. So we'll have to wait and see what actually comes out of it, what is in the official readout and what is behind the scenes as well. But no doubt we'll have our eye on this important visit tomorrow and where the India-US relationship progresses under the Biden administration. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the show today.